This is third person in CS2, and this is third person Maya mode, which locks your camera while still allowing you to move with the exact same inputs. This is obviously terrible for surf because you can't see, but I wondered, is it possible to beat any surf map in CS2 without ever turning your camera? And if so, how fast could we do it? There was one rule for this challenge. Every run had to start in Maya mode looking directly at the player. I could have started looking forward, but that would have been boring. And I also knew eventually the camera would turn around and we'd be blind anyway. The plan was to spend a bunch of time on each map, eliminate them until I had a winner, and then complete the final map. All that was left was to give it a try. First map, Utopia by Panzer. And I could tell immediately this was gonna suck. Like, walking forward feels like you should be pressing S because you're walking backwards, but it's W. And once I finally learned how to leave the start, I couldn't even stay on the ramps. When you surf forward, it's super easy. You just press yourself against the ramp, A went on the right and D went on the left, but now if I pressed right, it moved me left on the screen. And I was actually starting to get nauseous. It was weird. But slowly I started inching through. Thankfully, on a lot of these ramps, you can just do nothing and drop to the next, and eventually I got to the first turn. Now here's the thing about turns. As soon as it starts, you're blind. You can no longer tell how far left or right you are, and you can't even see the damn ramp. This is because our camera is locked and behind everything, and if I could only get past this, I'd get a huge straightaway, all part of my plan. And the time that I finally got it, I immediately failed. But then I started hitting the turn more and more frequently, leaving earlier and getting height. And I was right. If the camera's in your favor, the inputs will click just like normal, but like every map I would try, at one point it goes sideways again. And later I hit another roadblock, a long ramp that wrapped back towards the map, which I tried for the rest of the session, didn't hit it. In this first round, I had decided on 20 minutes for each map, but I should probably tell you why I picked these maps in particular. Utopia doesn't have a lot of turns. It seems like there are, but there are long, consistent stretches and lots of places where I'd be forward way easier. Some maps wrap around and go crazy impossible, which is why I picked the next map. Lots of stretches, but it turns out that that was a mistake. Boreas by Synchronize. Now this is one of the easiest maps in the game and a lot of people's favorite that I thought would be good for the challenge. We're going to be backward here because it eventually turns around, giving us plenty of time to see what's happening. Instead, I was stuck on the first 4 ramps the entire attempt. I was completely confused and just kept slamming and killing all my speed. Really, I struggled to line myself up. Unlike Utopia, where most ramps are in parallel, all the ramps on Boreas are at different angles. You can't just drop and pray, and especially the third ramp was completely blind, with no real way to tell how far to turn. I hadn't realized it was backwards and then sideways for this long, and honestly in this session I got barely anything done. And moved on to the third map, Mesa, super classic by Artblarg. This one had a slightly easier beginning. You just drop off this ramp into the one below and then flick across. I spent most attempts trying to clear the first gap. You actually need a lot of speed, and obviously you can't see the ramps you land on. And eventually I figured out I need to strafe around and delay in this area to land flush on the second ramp and get tons of speed. At this point I was feeling much more confident about surfing backwards, but the section after was just ridiculous. There are random hanging rocks to smack and end the run, and a break between the ramps you fall into. Mostly I failed on the curve, which you can't see coming, and eventually can't see at all. And when I finally did, the back of the ramp blocked my view again because you are now sideways and the camera is behind it. I was feeling really stupid, and of course I hit a ramp bug. Invisible bugs where the ramp will suddenly stop you. But just like Boreas, I knew a huge forward stretch was coming if I could just make it to the next section, and one more fail marked the end of round 1. By this point, I'd beaten about 60% of Utopia compared to like 10% of Boreas, not a good sign. But Mesa felt better, and although I was still a fraction of the way through, I knew what was coming next. For round 2, I decided to increase my sessions to 45 minutes so I could go a little deeper, which didn't really help, as back on Utopia, there wasn't much improvement in my second session. I spent most attempts losing at the first curve, other curves in the middle, and the final long curve. And at the very end of the 45-minute section, I finally made it past, and then completely choked. especially getting off the ramp where we were again behind it. I was also discombobulated by this point. During this one turn, your perspective changes like 3 times, and it feels nothing like what it does normally. And I realized that much of the section after, the hardest part, would again be backwards. But I was getting much faster and more consistent, and it was starting to look really cool, I'm not gonna lie. Back on Boreas, I'm stuck at the same spot. You're behind the ramps and it's all sideways. I even went into regular third person to plan a route and get some muscle memory. I cannot believe how much easier it was this way, holy. And it helped. I was getting a mental image of where the ramps were, but I was still spending hundreds of attempts here, no progress. And of course, a ton of ramp bugs. I was starting to think this just feels wrong, it feels alien. I was genuinely more nauseous by the minute, and sometimes you can't even tell what you did wrong because you can't see it. Yet finally, with time almost up, I got past the first choke. And to my disappointment, it was completely sideways. This entire section wasn't easier and would have to be done blind, and I was still getting ramp bugs. God damn it, CS2. My last hope for the day was Mesa. I kept up my strategy, delay, weaving around at the start, and I started to get really good speed. Contrary to what you might think, speed actually makes things easier in this challenge. It means you can ignore the finer movements and just yeet yourself forward, flying through the air rather than dealing with the ramp. And again, I used third person, this time to get a reference point for this troublesome gap. So I chose these rocks on the right. When I got to them in my run, I'd know to start my jump, hopefully getting enough air and distance to make it through. I knew if I could just get past this bend, I'd be home free. And after a half an hour of attempts, I hit it. I didn't have a lot of speed, but it was huge progress for me, and I was right. When the camera is pointed in the correct direction, this map was a breeze too. And I was more than 50% done with Mesa. I might actually be able to beat a map with these stupid settings. But eventually, it turned around again, and I knew it was far from over. Now, we had some decisions to make. First, I decided to move down to half an hour per session. I wanted to prevent myself from getting stuck and feeling burnt out and about to puke. And second, I was striking Boreas. I was spending way too much time on the first section of the map, and I still didn't know how the rest of the map would play out, a massive gamble, which means we only had 2 maps left to try. Back on Utopia, I was finally getting consistent. I was succeeding in the early sections more often, which gave me more and more attempts at the choke point, the hard part, and sometimes I even made it past, until it started to turn around again. I still failed occasionally at the start, but it looks so good. It's starting to look like I'm surfing regularly and we're just watching a demo. One thing that made the curve easier was again, speed. When you're slow, it's kind of like a top that's slowing down, it's unstable, but when you're fast, one smooth turn will keep you on or around the ramp. Until the end, of course. And I even made it 2 ramps further on my next attempt, but no further. This entire section was backward. The whole difficulty of this challenge was having to rerun the entire stage just to learn a single section, only to fail and not really know why. I had some decent runs before the session ended, but that was it. Next, we skipped Boreas as it was a lost cause, and meanwhile Mesa was looking slow as well. The ramp bugs were insane on this map, at least one every other run. I lost so many attempts after not making it to my safe zone, my only forward section, and I did some dumb stuff, I'm not gonna lie. But now that the easiest part was over, I would still have to make it through a long backward section, and I spent the rest of the session colliding with rocks and hitting more ramp bugs, as well as this one last try. And at this point I realized the winning map was starting to emerge. Utopia was clearly going to be easier if I could just figure out this last section. In regular surf, many do this area by going around a long cylinder for a smooth landing on the other side, but world record runners instead flick early off this ramp, barely dodge the ceiling and go straight through. That was my plan, and as a bonus would require less speed, not having to deal with this big cylinder, but it would have to be done blind. And I knew just to the right was the final section that would be entirely forward and nearly unfailable. Until this happened. On February 7th, 2024, a call to arms released to the public, the first update for CS2 in about 2 months. And while people were happier, this is what happened to Surf. You can still move, but it just looks so weird, and probably unrelated to the legs, the amount of ramp bugs increased as well. Ramps that were usually fine were now broken, even in ridiculous places that never had issues prior, and all 3 maps were almost completely unplayable. However, I did have a solution. We could return to the days of old. Before subtick and flying players, we could go back to CSGO. But Maya mode is a little different in the older Counter-Strike. If you tab out, your mouse is now locked to the top left of the screen. This is how they do this. I don't even know how they did this. And you can change your camera position using Alt, but we're not going to use this. Before Surf broke, I did have some good runs in CS2. All of my runs ended at this last glass ramp after this skip. It was really hard to tell where you were, and there's a backwards curve. But I did have this great attempt with tons of speed, but ultimately smacked my head, ending the run. And so it was off to CSGO. Within a few minutes, I was back to normal, and after just 20, I had this insane attempt around the wall and halfway to the final ramps. And after 8 hours, I hit this run. Off the glass ramp, dodging the wall, and finally touching the final ramps. Now, Valve may have broken Surf in CS2, but if you want to try it for yourself, click on the community browser or check out the alternatives like CS2 browser or Honest Steam browser, or play them for yourself through the workshop. If you enjoyed this, check out my latest video where I played Surf in Atomic Heart, that weird robot game. It was crazy. Bye.